Welcome back to this video series on Angular, Node and MySQL login system. In the previous videos we've created the sign up functionality where a user enters their details in this Angular reactive form, their email, password and username, and on the MySQL database this is saved through a Node API request, and the connection from the server is connected to this database, and their name, email, an auto-incremented ID and a hashed password is saved in the database. So in this video I'd like to cover the login authentication, and the login authentication works in the following way. So essentially we pass in a username and a password, and we'll create this in just a moment, this form here. And from their email and their password form fields, that data is sent to the RESTful API, the Node API that we created, and with that email and the password, the server is able to validate that authenticated data by checking that the hash password, so the password that they enter in the moment is just a string, and then on the back end they'll get hashed, and then they'll get compared to the hashed password that's in the database here. And if all is well and good, a JWT or a JSON web token, which is just a JSON, it's just JSON data or a payload with a signature that can only be verified by the server, they'll be generated by the server and will be stored in the client in local storage. So on the front end you can attach that token to further API requests that require authentication, and with that we can get the response back if the user is indeed authenticated and authorized to do so. So what I might do first is just quickly copy this form here and copy that into the login part here. So in the code here we can go to the login component, and on the front end of course, and we're going to copy this code from the sign up section that we just created in the previous video. And I might actually get the form fields going first so we don't get any errors or anything like that. So I might just put these side by side like that, and I'm just going to more or less just copy a few things here. So I'm going to copy in this form control form group validators from Angular Forms, and I'll also get this auth service because we're going to need it when we set up authentication regarding the login API request, and they'll be there in the service there. So let's just get those in there. Next I'll just copy this sign up form here, and I can copy that in here, and I'll just rename it to login form, and I may as well just inject that auth service here, and in the ng on a init lifecycle method we can that's where we can set this login form to this create form group function, and of course we can get that as well. And I'll just create this login function here, which won't really do anything just yet, but it'll just say console log 123 just as a placeholder. So this form group here that we're creating, we're just going to take away this name because they'll only need the email and password to log in, and the same validators are there, so it's required email for the email field and a min length of 7 and required for the password. So we can just save that, and we can close up the sign up component now because we no longer need anything to copy from there, and in the HTML we can just copy that over, and I'll copy that in here. So we can just get rid of a couple of things here. Firstly we just need to change the word sign up wherever it is to login. So we've got the login form, the login method. We can get rid of this first form field group here, first name. And then we have the email with the same placeholders and this password field here as well. And then there'll be a button and they'll be disabled unless everything's valid, and they'll be submitted through this ng submit, which will call the login method. Okay, great. So let's just test that out. Check everything's working okay. And of course we just need to add a little bit of styling. We can copy that over as well. It's no big deal. So in the sign up component, we can just copy that. And of course we could refactor this globally, but you know, it's not really focusing on styling here. We just focus on getting something quick and working going. So with that, we can see that we've got these fields here. And okay, and then if it's valid, we get this sign up here. If it's less than say 7, you know, we get this error here and it's not able to click that button to log us in. But if it is, we can click sign up. I might just delete this token, that's from earlier. And we get this 123 method here. Okay, great. So that's the UI, the Angular UI. Now we need to create the backend API request. So we fill this data in and then we need to check that password, that hash password matches a hash password, and if it does, we need to generate a JSON web token that we just briefly saw in memory in the in application in the console there. And we'll see that again shortly after we create the functionality for it. But with that said, we can go to the back end, and I'm just going to close this sign up for now. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that we've already created this on the user model in the back end, this find method here. So we give it an email and then we find a whole row based on that email. So we're going to use that functionality. So for example, if I type in john@gmail.com, I'll get this whole row, and then that's how I'm going to access some of the details, including the password, the hashed password, to check for if that matches with the data that they're going to enter in here. So we can just take a look. We can just firstly create our route. So we can do that, and we do that in the following way. Well, we can just copy the way we've done it here, I guess. And it's also going to be a post request. And we're going to, on the auth controller, we're going to create something called login. So a login method on that, and I'll just save that like that. It breaks for now because it's not created just yet, but we can just essentially just close this up here and create this auth method. Now I can also close this now. I've shown you and reminded you of the find method. So I'm just going to copy this sort of format here so I can quickly generate the shell for our login method here. And we will need JSON web token, so I'm going to install, well, we've already installed that, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to import that. So I'm going to import the JWT and store it in a constant variable, JWT, and that's going to be done by requiring it in from the JSON web token package. Okay, so we have this asynchronous function here because we're going to need to use the await keyword to await for asynchronous tasks, and in particular we're going to use that find method that we just looked at, and that's how we're going to store the user. So the user, so once again the row of the associated email, so if I look for john@gmail.com, it's going to return that row with ID2, Jono for the name, and this hashed password. So what we can do is we can store that by awaiting the response from the user class with a static method find by passing in the email. But we can't do that just yet because of course we need to extract the email. So we need the email, and that comes from the request body on the email field, i.e. we're going to send this in the request and the password in the request. So we also need the password, of course, and I might just change this here to password. And because we're doing an asynchronous operation here, I might just wrap this in a try catch block. So we'll try to do the asynchronous task, but if we can't do it, we can essentially just catch that error and we can give it a status code of 500 if one isn't already set. But we will set one. And that's just a backup default in other situations. And of course I can move this asynchronous request into the try block. Now, once I have the row of the user, well, we need to check if that exists. So if the user, and there should only be one user, so we can do this check here to check that the length is not equal to 1. So if the user's length is not equal to 1, because in MySQL we could, we could be getting back 10 users, for example. We didn't write that query, but if we did write that query, we'll need to check the length of it to be 1. So we're only interested in non-duplicate entries. So we don't want more than 1, and if it's less than 1, then it's obviously not found in the database in the first entry there. And so if it's not found, we'll need to throw an error. And the error is essentially just going to be saying back to the user, a user with this email could not be found. And we can give it our own status code. So for that error object that we just created, we can make our own property up here for the status code, which I've been doing previously, and give it a 404 and then throw that error. Now the 401 is not authenticated because the email couldn't be found, so we couldn't authenticate that user, and hence we won't give it a JSON web token, and the throw error will exit out of the try block, so anything below here that we're going to create won't be executed. This error will of course be caught by the catch function, and since it's not the 500 status code, or status code's created as a 401, that will be sent to the error handling controller that we created, and make our application just handle that appropriately without crashing or anything like that. So we know that the stored user, we know if we got to this point that we have one row back, so we've gotten one of these entries back, and that's great. That means the email address does exist, but we also want to check that the password matches. So to do that, we can firstly just extract the stored user into a variable so we can work with it easier. And we know that the stored user is from here, but it's also going to be, the details of that user is going to be in the first entry in there as well. And there might be some other, in other elements, there might be some other details such as like a message and headers and all that sort of stuff, but we are only interested in the user data itself, and we need to check that it's equal. So I'll create this variable here and I'll call it is equal, and this is going to be an asynchronous operation, so we're going to need to await for something, and we're going to use the bcrypt library here once again, and this is going to compare the password that was sent, so what we input into this field here. So we've already checked that the email exists. Now we're going to check that the password that was entered, which is just a string at this stage, but what this function from the bcrypt library compare will do is it will hash this password and we can compare it to the stored user, and I'll give that a lowercase s here, of course. The stored user, which we retrieve from the database. So this hash password, so we'll compare the input password and hash it and compare it to the hash password that exists in the database. And we need to wait for that operation to occur. So there's going to be a asynchronous operation there, so we need to wait for that to be is equal. And is equal, if that is compared and the password does match the database, if the hash password matches the password that's stored in the database which has been hashed, is equal will return true, and if not, it will return false. So once again, we need to have this preventive measure so it doesn't generate a JSON Web Token by having this if statement here. So if it's not equal, i.e. the password they entered doesn't match the stored password, we can just throw an error. So we can just create another error here and create a new error just saying wrong password, because the email address exists because I got to this stage, but the error so what I'll do is I'll just copy this error here, because the status code of the error I just copied is a 401 as well. The password is wrong, so that it also means that the authentication's failed, so it's not authenticated, and I'll throw that error so the code doesn't continue, and once again it will be handled by our error handling functions that we created. But if they got to this stage, we can create a JSON Web Token. So let's do that. So we can create this JSON Web Token, and I might actually just call it token in this case, because we're going to use the JWT package that we just imported, and there's a particular function here called sign. And what sign takes is it takes the payload data. So what this JWT thing is doing is it's creating a JSON Web Token, which is a cookie that can be accessed in the client through local storage, and that's going to have an associated payload. So you know, it might have you know, some details relating to the email address or the user ID or something like that, and we can also give that a secret. So the server needs to validate a particular secret. So since this cookie is stored on the client, when the client, they make requests and they attach the token, that token has the secret and whatever else they need related to the payload to authenticate it, which will be authenticated through the server once again. So this so first I'll just create payload. So we're going to have the email, and we created that. We got the user email. We got the stored user, which has all the properties from the MySQL row, and we'll just get the email and the user ID here. But here, as a second argument, this is where we have the secret, and I'm just going to call this secret for token. So once the user enters their email and password in and it matches, we can create this JSON Web Token. The JSON Web Token is going to have a payload, and in this case it's going to have an email and a user ID, and then the server is going to generate this sort of encrypted data, so to speak, with an associated secret, and this secret is administered by the server, and then once the user makes a further request, it's going to be checked by this server that this secret matches. So there's sort of a couple of layers of security here. The first is the hashing of the password in the database and then checking for the hash, and the second is providing this extra sort of server rendered or server administered secret. So, and as a final argument here, what I'll do is I'll just attach this expires in, and I'm just going to say 1 hour here, like that, so I can save that. And okay, so with that, the user, we just need to send that back to the client. So after the client makes the request and it gets to this stage, everything's all good, we can send a response back to the client and everything's all good. So we give them a 200, and we're going to give them JSON data back, and we'll just give them the token back that just got generated based on that data and the secret. And then we can have the user ID as well, just as a quick access in case we want to access that for some reason. If not, all errors will get caught. And with that, that's how we can create the JSON Web Token through the server. So, okay, so we've created the JSON Web Token, or we've created the capability to generate a JSON Web Token. We now need to go back to the front end. So in the login section here, once we make this request, we need to make an API. Well, we need to make the functionality on the front end to make the API request. So let's go ahead and do that. So how we can do that is we go back over to this auth service, and this is where we made our sign up functionality here. And one thing to note is we're using this URL, so I might just go ahead and just remove this /signup part here, because we're going to essentially use the same stub part of this URL, and we're just going to change to the n2/login for the new login method. So I'll just adjust this ever so slightly to use the template literal syntax with the $ curly brackets inside the backticks, and then just append this sign up like that. So I'm able to, I'll just sort of copy the shape of this, and that will give us the login. Now, login is going to take, rather than emitting the user ID, we just want to, we don't even want the user there at all. We want an email and a password, and we can actually pick something from the user model, and we can pick the email. So that's the type for the email. The second entry that we'd like here is the password, and I'm just going to copy this shape once again, and this will be by picking the password from the user. Now, this is going to return observable, of course, but we just made it so that we're returning this token, which is a string, and the user ID, which is related to the user type. So I'm going to return a particular object here, and it's going to be in the following form. So the token is just a string, and the user ID, well, that's more or less this here. So I'll just copy this one actually. That's of the type user ID. Now we will need to change things, of course. For example, we're not posting the user, and this URL /login will be the URL that we're after. Now, rather than sending the user here, what we want to send is we want to send the email and the password. And this is just sort of shorthand syntax for that JSON object. So, you know, like that, essentially. And this HTTP options, which is just saying that we're sending the content type as JSON, that's going to be relevant. So we'll keep that as well. And we only want the first one, so we don't have to unsubscribe to it. We do want to catch the error, and the error will handle is going to be of that same type that we just created as the response here. So this will be the new type here, like that, and this will be login. But before we catch the error, we want to sort of tap into the response. So we can go ahead and we can get that as well. And we have tap. I don't think we have tap, so let's just get tap as well. So we'll get tap. And the tap, we're going to get the token object back. So let's just go ahead and from the token object that we're getting back, which is of this type here, so we're tapping into that. And do we have catch error? Yeah, we have a catch error, of course. This needs to have this here. Is that right? Let me just read through this. So the login method, we're going to get an email and a password from the client. The email is of type email from the user model, and the password is the password from the user model. And we want to return back a token and the user ID, which is going to be generated by the server after it passes all of the, you know, if the email exists and the hashed password matches, we'll create that JSON web token and we can pass that back. So that's the type matching up okay. And then we make the HTTP request by posting to the localhost 3000 auth URL /login, the email and password it's expecting, and in JSON format. But with that observable, we pipe into it and we just do the first one to avoid any memory leaks or anything like that, and it's all we're really interested in anyway. And we can tap into the response and we'll get for the token object, which is going to be of the type token user ID. What we can do here is this is where we need to map it to something that we're going to do. So just right here like this. This is where we're going to set the token, and we might extract the user ID and if the user is logged in or not. So to do that, we're going to need to create two variables, and I'll create those. So the first is the most important thing that we need from the service, because the service is going to be accessible in multiple components. So we need to constantly be observing this value to see if the user is logged in, and it's a particular variable. So we're going to make it an observable, but in particular we're going to create this new behavior subject of the type boolean. And the reason we make it a behavior subject rather than a subject is because we want to initially set it to false. So we've imported behavior subject from RxJS. It's a type of observable, and what it's going to do is it's going to give us like a global variable or observable variable that's going to tell us if the user is logged in and if it's not, because on different pages and elsewhere in our application we want to display different things based on this. And while I'm here, I may as well get the user ID. So let's get the user ID, because we may want to check if the user is signed in, or if a particular user is signed in, so they can delete only their own posts based on their user ID. So we got those two variables there. So with those, we can come back to our login method, and we can, in the response here, we can do something. And in particular, we can just set this user ID equal to the token object, and that user ID that we get from there. Now what we want to do is we want to actually do something in local storage here. So in local storage, we just want to set an item, and we want to set an item token, and we want that to be the token object dot token. Now we can, so what we've done is we've said, okay, we've got the token back from the server. Now we just want to store that response in local storage. So it's accessible in local storage through the application tab in Google Chrome. But then we also want to, in this case, since they're logged in, we want to say, is user logged in? And we can't set this to false, but what we can do, because we created a behavior subject, is just call this next function here to give, rather than like an observable being passive, this is more active in the sense that we can actively set it based on something rather than in response to a HTTP request. So we can just set that to true, so we can render the UI appropriately. And what I might do here as well is I might just, so if they're logged in, you go from the login menu to the post section. So I'll just use the router to navigate to the post section. And of course, I'm going to need to inject that into the constructor. So I will inject the router, type router, auto import that, and it's from Angular, so I'm going to put it up the top. I like to organize it so Angular's on top, then third parties next, and then my stuff's at the bottom here. So we're able to reroute to the post tab after they're logged in, and then we're also just catching some errors here. Okay, so that's looking good. I think we're in a pretty good spot here. All we really need to do is just create the functionality in the login. So recall on the page we made this login method here. We just gave it a dummy value of console log, and we've already injected the auth service, so that's really good. So all we really have to do is just, when we have this login function called by clicking the button, we just call this auth service, and we pass in the login, we're using in the login functionality, which is just the email and a password, and we can get the email and password from the login form that we just created. So, and we called it login form, so we can just say this login form, the value, and in particular the email value, that's going to be the email, and then obviously we want the same thing for the password. And then all we want to do is just subscribe to that. And we don't have to unsubscribe because we're just doing the first, so there's no memory leaks. And this isn't going to return anything, this is just going to be a void function. So let's test it out. So we open up the browser, and I'm just going to open up this application here. See, the local storage is empty. Now I already have this email here. I might use this john@gmail.com and a password, and I'll just set it to password. So I'm going to say john@gmail.com, and I'll change this to password. Now let's see. We click sign up. What do we get? Okay, we get an error here. Okay. So there's an error with the login, and that's just due to I accidentally typed in sign up here, and obviously the route in the auth.js routes folder, that should be login. So let's try this again, and we'll refresh this. So if I try john@gmail.com this time, this should work out. And if I sign up here, okay, it's redirected to the post, so that's good. That indicates that in the application we can see that we've been generated this token. So what happened there is from the login menu, I typed in my details. The password got, well, firstly the email got checked that it wasn't already in existence. Oh, sorry, that's for the sign up. The so what I meant to say was that the login, the username or the email address, sorry, that was checked in the database to see if it existed. So obviously john@gmail.com exists, so it made it past the first check here from login to see if it exists, or in the case it doesn't exist. And then we got the string password that we entered in here. We checked that the hash of that is equal to that of the hash password that exists in the database. Otherwise, you know, it's not authenticated, and we send a 401. But I typed that incorrectly, so I got that the user is able to get this JSON web token, and it has this associated data with it and expires in an hour, and that got sent back to the client in the auth service. And you know, you type something in, you type in the email and password, you make the API request, and you give back the JSON web token, and handling any errors where appropriate. And then that's implemented in the component. So if we call the login method by submitting the validated form on the client, and then it checks that on the backend as well, then you get your JSON web token. And this is the JSON web token here. It's in local storage in the application tab. And if I just copy all this and put it into here, JWT.io, we can see that we get the email and the user ID here. So yeah, so this is how we can use JSON web tokens and Bcrypt to securely log in. In the next video, I would like to take a look at using that JSON web token in our request. So I'm going to cover that in the next video. So thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you then.